There we go. Just took a while. So I know many of you have been to Laurel Hill, but I thought it would be good to just start with a little bit of background. It was founded in 1836 by the gentleman on your left, John J. Smith, who was a publisher, a librarian, and a really, really good horticulturalist. Not professional, but he certainly traveled with a lot of folks who were. And he was really the driving force behind the creation of Laurel Hill when he visited the grave of his 5-year-old daughter, who was buried at the time in a graveyard in Old City. And he was really appalled by the condition in which he found her and made it his mission to begin and to start a cemetery somewhere outside of Philadelphia, which Laurel Hill was at the time, and a beautiful site where people could bury their loved ones respectfully and be assured that their grounds would be well maintained in perpetuity. He gathered a couple of his friends, Nathaniel Dunn, who was a well-known merchant, Ben Richards, who was a former mayor, and Frederick Brown, a well-known druggist. And 4 of them began looking for property. They visited the woodlands, but they wouldn't sell the woodlands. Then they went up to where Girard College is right now. Didn't satisfy their aesthetics. It was too flat, and they wanted something much more beautiful. And then they found the Sims estate along the Schuylkill River and purchased that in 1836. So this is an image of when it was first developed. It was designed by architect John Notman. It is the second rural cemetery in the country, the first being Mount Auburn in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Originally, the Sims estate, which was known as Laurel Hill, that's where it got its name, was about 32 acres, but today we are 78 acres. And the remaining acreage was purchased over several decades to get to the 78 acres it is now. Laurel Hill was then constrained when Fairmount Park came into being, and it couldn't grow any further in its spot. I won't get into it, but I will just mention that John J. Smith then reached over the Schuylkill River into Bala Cynwyd, and he purchased what is now known as Laurel Hill West, and it is now 185 acres. So together we consider ourselves Laurel Hill, and we are an accredited arboretum, level 2 arboretum. And I will say that Laurel Hill East in East Falls is the first cemetery in the nation to be named National Historic Landmark, and that title was received in 1998. When I came, we did a strategic plan that really established the pillars under which we operate today, and they're very, very easy to remember and understand. There are 3 buckets. One is eternal rest. Obviously, that has everything to do with the burial and death industry that we do. So funerals, burials, pet burials, that all falls under our eternal rest bucket. The second bucket is recreation, and that is our tours, our events that we do, all of the activities. We are open 365 days a year for free. Anybody can come and walk and bird watch or paint or just stroll the grounds. And then the third bucket is civic value. We strongly believe that the mere fact that our 265 acres is in this region really adds value to the arts, the culture, the historicity of our region, and really is what makes Philadelphia such a wonderful community to live in. And underlying all of that is sustainability. It permeates our culture, everything we do, and is a major factor in why we did this hillside restoration project. Let me just start with the vision that I had when I came in 2018. To me, Laurel Hill, the cemetery, is like the Acropolis. I saw it on top of this beautiful hill. I wanted to see it lit. I wanted to see the Wissahickon schist exposed. And gradually over the years, this is what we're soon accomplishing. So in 2019, we got a grant to begin putting together a lighting plan for the entire cemetery. We began first with 11 monuments right at the corner of Hunting Park and Kelly Drive. We received a wonderful grant from the William Penn Foundation and the McLean Contributionship. And this is what it looks like now. I always ask why, when the bridges are lit and Boathouse Row is lit and the sculpture is lit, why wasn't Laurel Hill lit? And so finally, here we are, and it's really made a difference. Our goals obviously were to gain visibility, refresh our identity, and really become known as one of the great cultural institutions that you just can't miss when you're driving. So with that accomplished, the next step was, okay, now what are we going to do with that hillside? Now that we've lit the beautiful monuments and some of the trees, we have this hillside that is not really supporting a healthy environment. And so we applied for a grant from the Department of Community and Economic Development. We received $157,000. And with a lot of support from a lot of individuals and a few other foundations, we had sufficient funds to begin to implement this project. We did retain Larry Weaner Landscape Associates to do the design, and are fortunate to be working with Rebecca. And once that design was done, we were able to retain RES, which is the company that Mike works with. And we're on our way restoring that hillside. So with that, I am going to turn it over to the folks who are actually doing the work, and they will explain what we're doing.
Thanks, Nancy. So my name is Rebecca Kagle. I work for LWLA, and just briefly, we're based in Glenside, Pennsylvania, and we've been around for 30 years. We're 12 people now, and we do work all over the Northeast. Really, all you can see. This is a map from 2020, but we do a lot of work from north of New York City, around DC. We have one project at Kew Gardens in England, but we really sort of focus on this area. We do design work, which is our purview for this project. We also do installation and maintenance. In this project, we just sort of did design work. And I just always like to show the team, just because it's a great group of people who really are doing really great work. I will say Laurel Hill is we've done another project there. We've also done work at Mount Auburn Cemetery, Evergreen Cemetery, Greenwood Cemetery. So we find these sort of historic cemeteries just have so much opportunity for these kind of projects. But this one was a really special one that I'm excited to talk to you guys about. Next. In terms of what we do, we're really known for native plant design, both sort of in the residential garden all the way up to these big public areas. We're really well known for working with seed. So we work with plants, plants in pots and plants in ball and burlap and of all sizes. But for over 30 years, we've really been sort of figuring out how do you make something from the seeded landscape work. And in this context, our knowledge about that, I think, is one of the reasons that Nancy and her team reached out for us. We really think about this idea of designing for maintenance. So you can come up with the most beautiful design, but if you don't know how to either yourself or someone else know how to sort of take care of this and steward this landscape over time, it's going to revert back to what it was. And so we really sort of pride ourselves on thinking about that management right from the beginning of any project. Next. So when Nancy and Aaron first brought us to come look at this site, they walked us around, and I'd obviously seen this. I live in Mount Airy. I used to live in Fairmount, so I had driven this road so many times, and until I walked around with them, I wasn't even really sure that I didn't know it was the cemetery's property. I knew the cemetery was above, but I really didn't know sort of who managed it or who took care of this area. But it was such an opportunity, both from the many ways that you can see it, from in the cemetery, from the road, from the bike path, potentially from the river, but also as a really daunting project. It's extremely steep. It is not an easy site to access in either direction. We've worked on steep slopes before, but often they're sort of, you can enter it from both sides. But in this case, you've got Kelly Drive right below you. But I also thought this is something that really so many people will interact with, and it's such an opportunity. And we were really excited to get started. Next, we worked with Nancy and her team to sort of figure out the goals for the project. Then they really echo, I think, some of these sort of the 3 pillars that she was talking about. We're really looking at enhancing wildlife habitat through nesting, foraging, that type of thing, looking at sort of water quality and stormwater management. And then again, this idea of really connecting people to their environment in a different way was really important to us. And then, like I said, I wasn't sure if this was part of the cemetery when I, had driven by so many times. And so I think this opportunity to make sure that people thought this slope is cared for, that it really is sort of the gateway and connected to this really incredible landscape and space above it, was really important to us as well. So all those things sort of played into when we started thinking about this design project. Next slide. Again, just we were really looking at all of these different goals. So whereas the cemetery has its 3 pillars, we sort of thought the same way. We thought about wildlife, the planet, and people, and how with just this one sort of 3-acre parcel, we could really give benefit to all 3 of those pillars. Next. So with any project, the first thing that we always do is we try to understand the existing conditions. When we look at existing conditions, we look at vegetation, we look at soil. The soil can really tell us a story of what's happening. We look at human use, we look at access, we look at all of these different things to try and determine the best course of action. And even though this is just sort of one long corridor, it was not uniform in its existing conditions. And that really was going to lead to how we thought about the project. So you can see here, there's this sort of gateway right where that lighting picture that Nancy showed, along Hunting Park Avenue, not a very steep slope, but your car is going to be very close to it. Next. There were these beautiful rock outcrops that for the most part had been sort of overgrown, but there were the statue there was some lighting, so we had to think about how we manage those. Next. And then this was really sort of the typical scene, this just sort of mass of vegetation. And this photo sort of shows that there are these vines, you can see them creeping over the walls that just covered everything. Some of them were perennial and have sort of a woody structure. Others were annuals that just come up and put on tons of growth. And then peppering through that is sumac, which is a native clonal tree species, a sort of a small tree. It's beautiful in the fall. Its fruits are edible to humans, but as well as very valuable for wildlife. So we had this sort of balance of wanting to protect the trees, both the large trees as well as the sumac. We also knew that we had to get rid of these vines if we wanted any of the native species to have a chance to take hold. Next. And again, you can just see it here, that sort of interface between the road, the sumac, which is, again, that sort of mass in the upper corner, and then that invasive vegetation. Next. So once we sort of took in all of this data, we began to work on our design. So when we thought about the design, we sort of had these various considerations. So we wanted the user experience and of all types. We wanted to keep that in mind. We wanted to be really aware of the views. I mean, some of these places you can walk, you can see the Strawberry Mansion Bridge. You can see the Police Touch Museum in the distance. So we really wanted to make sure that we were highlighting those really incredible views. We're very keyed into slope stabilization, both in the long term, right? We want to make sure that that soil is going to stay in place, not go on the road or, in the river. And we also knew that anything we came up with that was going to expose soil, we needed to really think about how do we make sure that soil and water are not moving quickly down that slope. We really wanted to make sure we were enhancing habitat. And we were fortunate, and Mike will talk in much more depth about this, but the best way to know if you're enhancing habitat is to have baseline, what's there now in terms of wildlife, and then do this big restorations, big design, and monitor it later and see, okay, do we truly enhance the habitat, or is it just a pat ourselves on the back, we put into native plants sort of project? So we're gonna, Nancy will have all of that data, and Mike's going over the baseline stuff today. And then for better or for worse, in my office, I'm the really pragmatic one. I think maybe sort of boring to the other folks in the office, but I want something always designed that I know can be built. I know that the people on the ground are going to be able to take care of it. That's my background, was doing the physical work. So I don't want to see a design that is so fussy that it's going to never be taken care of. And then also there were some really complicated regulatory parameters for this project, which I'll go into a little bit, that we knew we had to keep in mind, again, just because of where this project is and how it interfaces so many important things. We knew that any design that we were going to have was going to have to go through those parameters. So that's sort of what we looked at, and you can see each of these colors on the drawing really represents a different plant composition, either a seed mix or a shrub drift, or how we were going to interact with those existing sumac. Next. So what we always like to do is we like to use design precedents to get across, both to sort of ourselves as designers, but also to the client. So what is it we say when we say, okay, we've got an entrance seed mix, right? That could mean a million things. In this case, we were really thinking about this entrance seed mix, sort of bridging the gap between those two sides of Hunting Park Avenue, that real gateway, and that we thought of as much more sort of floriferous. It's also, while it's steep there, we thought it could take a little bit more sort of fine-tuned management. So we thought about that one way. Then we were responding to sun and shade along the slope. So we wanted a seed mix that would really knit together, but also have species in it that, if it was shadier, would do well, or was sunnier. So we're, again, knit together, but have some unique characteristics. Originally in the project, we had put in this idea of these shrublands, so more of these sort of clonal shrubs that will spread underground and pop up and sort of hold soil and outcompete weeds. That may go in later. It didn't happen in phase one, but that was another sort of component of the project. We really wanted to think about those sumac groves. So while the trees themselves were doing well, we wanted to make sure that anything growing up under them were not those weeds that we're trying so hard to control. And then finally, we really wanted to think about these really specialized rock outcrops. What plants could do well there that wouldn't do well otherwise, and that are sort of not common sort of in other types of habitats. So we get them to grow in this very unique rocky sort of outcrop, and also really highlight this beautiful feature. Next. Mike, I was going to let you talk about historical ecologies.
Cool, thanks. I'll just real quick note that, at RES, we were previously AES. We will often design, build, and maintain spaces, and we are sticklers for native plants. Often we'll look at designs that are put together, and we'll choose not to bid on them, or say, hey, we'll only bid on this if you change X, Y, and Z. When we looked at Rebecca's design, we knew this was a great design from the start, but actually when we knew that Larry Weaner Landscape Associates was doing this, we knew it would be a good design. So very seamless transition, and enthusiastically, typically I'd be on the design team talking about these historical ecologies. They were already baked into the landscape when my contracting team won this opportunity to build. But just to make mention, the Schuylkill River Valley, and we're sitting on some of the oldest geology in the Piedmont portion of the city of Philadelphia. This Wissahickon schist and gneiss is 1.1 billion years old, and there's these amazing hardwood forests that grow on them. Where the outcrops exist, there's a paucity of plant available nutrients. So you end up with this dynamism between upland mixed hardwood forests that have very old trees. Unfortunately, most of them have been cut, as mentioned before we got started. 80 to 120 years old is your average tree. based on prior logging history. But you have that mosaic mixed with these meadows and early successional habitats like the sumac shrubland and some of these great meadow components that Rebecca's team thoughtfully included in the design. So just adding a context that this check the box for, what an indigenous American 10,000 years ago may have seen along this beautiful geologic outcrop along the Schuylkill River. It's baked within our intent. So thanks.
Yeah, and I just want to echo one of the reasons that I love working with Mike and his team is that they're thinking about, especially as ecologists, sort of that next level of sort of depth and detail. And I learn from him every time, so it's great to hear. All right, next slide. So after we sort of took all this into account, we did our plant selection. We had, I think, 6 mixes. I'm not expecting you to read this seed mix, but what I like to sort of show is that we use, and I should have counted, but we use a large number of species in all of our mixes. And in particular here, we wanted to use plants that have different bloom times, different flower color, different flower shapes, different textures, partially to make sure we were sort of hitting the widest breadth of potential wildlife use. And then also to make sure that we had sort of a very robust mix. These are not the easiest conditions. And so we wanted to make sure we were sort of using the plants that we thought were the most likely to fall in and that they would sort of sort themselves out. So it's unlike a garden where you say, okay, I'm going to use, just a certain number of species and I'm going to really design where they go. In some ways, we're using a very high seed count, so a lot of seeds per square foot, and they'll sort of shift, sort of work themselves out. The other thing that's really important in seed mixes, again, different than a garden, is that you have sort of long-term species and short-term species. And the short-term species, so on this list, Plains coreopsis is a great example. It comes in really quick. You're going to see, you might even see flowers in the first or second year. And then for the most part, it's going to fade away. But what it's done in that time is it's held the soil. It's been a ground plane competitor with those invasive species. So by taking up space, it allows these long-term species that we expect to be there for many, many years, like the little blue stem or the mountain mint, to sort of take hold. And if you don't have the early successional species, this stuff comes in first, you're never going to have those long-term species because they can't. The weeds just take over. So there's sort of a lot of factors in play. In this case, we weren't as worried about. Sometimes we'll have clients who just want grassy looking species or only like certain colors. In this case, we really wanted stuff that's going to be sort of working all year round on the slope. Next. So you can have the world's best design, and I think we have a great design, but if you don't figure out site preparation, especially in a site like this, it does not matter how good your design is. And so we really had to figure out, how do we prep this site? And by preparing it, what really the sort of challenge is creating bare soil, so or close to bare soil, and really making sure that you've weakened the seed bank of those weedy species. So the way that the sort of general process is, you remove all of the top growth of the weeds. You have sort of all of a sudden light is hitting the soil that hadn't been hitting it before. You have a big second flush of weeds. You remove those as well. And then you can leave some of that dead thatch that can actually work sort of as for holding soil, and you seed into that. In this project, especially, that is a complicated endeavor. You really need to know the life cycle of these weeds, the best time and the best way to kill them. There's a bunch of different methodologies that my firm uses, including the use of herbicide, both organic and conventional, as well as mechanical removal, all of which have sort of different pros and cons. In this case, because these were incredibly pernicious weeds, we had to work in a way that we kept everybody safe. We used a mix of both herbicide and mechanical removal to just remove all that biomass. The thing that we're very careful not to do in almost all of our methodologies, but certainly in this one, is once we've sort of cleared the soil the first time, we do not want to do any soil disturbance. And there's multiple reasons for that. One is that we sort of flush the weeds, right? All of a sudden, sunlight has hit the soil, we've gotten a flush of weeds, we've killed it. If we do any disturbance, those weed seeds that are buried, that don't get enough light to germinate, all of a sudden they pop up, and you've got you sort of have to start your process again. And then also in terms of erosion, we don't want to do anything that's either going to heavily compact the soil and make water run up faster, or to tear it up so that that soil can move. We don't want to do that anyway, but certainly in this context, that would be really, really problematic. Again, when we thought about site prep, our number one concern was human safety in all different ways. And then again, making sure that we could sort of get good control. We didn't want to do this project unless we knew we could get really good weed control. And then just another challenge was that because we couldn't clear it, usually when we do site analysis, we have a really great sense of where water is moving, if gullies have been created, if there's small depressions or mounds. But here, because of the vegetation, we really couldn't see it. So one, there were some unknowns about the design itself, but in terms of safety, there were some unknowns. And Mike and his crew were really creative, and they sort of came up with this idea that they would do bands so that then the vegetation would die back, they could have good footing, and they could move their way down the hill. And so they were able to sort of uncover it over time and keep themselves safe, and also sort of adapt their practices as they move forward. I thought that was a great idea. Next. The other piece, so, again, design is great, but if site prep's not good, the design doesn't matter. And the truth can be said for Meadow Management. And I use this picture, one, because it just makes me laugh, because this was before my time at the firm, but this guy is doing his work, but also smoking a cigarette at the same time. Pretty incredible. But he's using a tool called, I guess it's called the side swipe. We now sort of make them ourselves, but essentially it's a PVC tube with a foam roller on it. You put a little bit of herbicide on that foam roller and just rub it over the tops of the species that you don't want. In this case, it looks like it's a invasive thistle. And what I love about this is, one, you have a lot of control, right? You're not going to be killing the other plants that you don't want to. You're using the fact that the thistle grows taller than the other species because it grows pretty rapidly to sort of control it. And in this case, we're using a very specific chemical that really targets thistle. So it's different than just going out and sort of broadcast spraying or having to do incredibly laborious work. One of the things that we really like to do is think about sort of brains over brawn, right? We need to figure out sort of ways that our knowledge can help us do these things in efficient ways. Otherwise, the problem is just too big or it won't get done. And I think this is a great solution, especially if you can do it while you're smoking a cigarette. And again, so the Meadow Management really has sort of three main tasks, no matter what the project, which are really monitoring and controlling weeds. We want to make sure that those weeds that were there are not coming back. We want to make sure that new weeds are not coming in, either because there's more sunlight or seeds that birds drop that used to not be able to take hold because of that mass of invasive species now all of a sudden can. We use mowing as a major tool there. The new seedlings, they're small, they don't have any root mass to build on, so they're growing pretty slowly. The weeds are growing much faster. And so just even the simple act of cutting on top of those weeds above the height of your seedlings is going to do so much to weaken those weeds, make sure they don't go to seed, and favor your little seedlings. And the goal is to make sure that these tasks are logical, that they get done, and that they sort of allow our seed mixes to thrive. Next. More specific to this project, these are newer pictures, so no one is smoking a cigarette. Is we use a bunch of tools to make this happen. So for this project, we had those sort of three typologies. We had where the sumacs are growing. We wanted to deal with that one way. We had the rock outcrops, and then we had sort of the main meadow areas. You can see all the way on the right is what we call an RC mower. This is a project in Chestnut Hill right outside of the Wissahickon, a private residence. And we used to have to take 4 or 5 days with a crew of 5 people to cut this field. And now with this small mower, it has a really low center of gravity, and you control it basically with like a remote control joystick. So you don't have to walk, you have to be close to it, but You don't need to be right next to it, and we're able to just cut these fields down. It's really incredible. Not super useful because of the sort of rock outcrops on this project, but I do think there are other places a tool like that can be really useful. We mostly at this point rely on string trimmers. So that middle picture, they're great because they're light. In this, you can use them when you're tied in and keep yourself safe. And you really do have a lot of control. Here, one of the guys on our crew, he's cutting around the plants that we want, cutting back the weeds to favor these aggressive native plants. And again, in some areas, he's going to go higher or lower. This picture on the left is at the Glenstone Museum, and that just shows sort of hand cutting. We don't pull weeds because, again, we really don't want to expose any new, any of that seed bank, right? We don't want new weeds to germinate. We want those to stay buried, and also the act of pulling can bury our native seeds, and also, depending on how the plant spreads, leave little roots that are just going to make more plants. So we do use hand cutting as well. So I'd say these are sort of mowing, string trimming, and hand removal are sort of our three main tools. Next. So as the project evolved, we realized we weren't going to be able to do the whole project at once. There were a couple of reasons for that. And it was really in our best advantage to sort of break it into a sub 1 acre parcel. And so working with Nancy and her team, we sort of decided that this was sort of the best place to start. We would get that sort of entrance, that threshold on Hunting Park Avenue, and a good sort of section on Kelly Drive. And we would sort of be able to try out all of these techniques while being in a really visible area. So that the yellow is the area that's in play right now. Next. Our original idea was that we were going to basically use the roots of those vines as our way of holding the slope. The idea is that the vines would be dead, but that their woody mass would sort of hold the soil. The seed would sort of fall through it and be able to germinate. I still think that could have worked, but understandably, the city of Philadelphia was a little nervous about that. They wanted to see that, they wanted to be really, really certain that nothing would happen in terms of soil movement. Also, they did something that is atypical that I'm still not sure I agree with in truth, which is they said the act of removing the vegetation, even if you're not disturbing the soil, is disturbance. It is in the same class as excavating to build a patio or some sort of building. And if you're doing that type of soil disturbance, you sort of trigger all of these other regulations. Once they made that decision, that was fine, and we adapted. I have not worked in any other municipality where they have determined sort of the type of vegetation we remove or that type of removal as disturbance. But that leads to sort of these details show, and Mike's going to talk more about it, sort of the burlap, which is a jute fabric. It's a coconut fiber having to be used throughout the site. So once we're able to sort of figure out these regulations, we worked with a group in LP, an engineering firm that has an office in Philadelphia that's really great and really good at permitting. We were able to put together a bid set and try and find, someone who would be interested in doing this work. The issue with it is really challenging. There were safety concerns. I think that no other group really had dealt with. And it's high risk. I mean, to us, it's really high reward. I think Mike would say the same thing, but some really good folks came out and they just sort of, the challenge was too much. And we just feel so lucky that we wound up working with Res to actually do this work. Next. So I'm going to hand over to Mike to talk about how they actually did this.
Great, thanks, Rebecca. And yeah, I'll mention that this was a challenging site. As you can see, it's very steep. At the bottom, you're typically met with a busy road. So a very small margin of error is tolerable. And forgive me, I have a daughter who has hearing loss who's getting in the shower and she's singing, so you might hear her. So really, what set us apart from other, qualified natural areas, landscape groups, there's some good competition in the region, was our crew has been doing work in the Niagara Gorge and other parts of the Finger Lakes, the lower Finger Lakes area, where we have all this training related to climbing up and down steep slopes to do endangered species propagation, invasive species management, and the like. So our crew was what looked like a big hurdle for others was something that we already had a precedent to work within. So it took some creativity, but as Rebecca had shown in some of those other graphics with the site prep, very interesting. I don't know if you guys noticed, but in all those pictures, there was a string attaching all those little people to a safety space up on the top. So that was an important component. And if you look here, number one there shows that very steep slope at the rock outcrops. The sumac is retained in the front end. You can see those beautiful inflorescence of the sumac in the front. And then you see that we've site prepped. We've cleared the invasive vegetation and we've put down these silt socks. And those are intended to capture, right? Gravity moves mountains, right? So it's important that we put these silt socks up just as a erosion and soil control method. I'm sure it was within the permit specifications. So we ran these socks, which proved to be a bit of a challenge. It was a very interesting one. And number two, you can see folks using the hose to actually blow mulch. So, and I guess the silt socks were, maybe Rebecca, you can confirm this for me, but maybe primarily played a key role in keeping that mulch where we want it to be, but prior to the plants, the seed stabilizing. So, yes. So in number three, you can see down below there is the corner of Hunting Park and Kelly Drive. So this is we're looking back on that, and you can see this hill slope that was truly nearly 100% in advanced, mature heterohelix, just English ivy, now cleared and prepped, mulched, and ready for seeding and erosion control blanket. And so in number four there, you can see this erosion control blanketing. So what's under that burlap? You got all that site prep to eradicate the invasive seed sources and existing plant material as best possible. Then you have silt socks that are there to hold soil in situ, and when it rains, to not bring all of our seed material down. There's a mulch that was put down along with seed, and then the mat itself. Next slide, please, Nancy.
There's one thing about the matting, just because it is sort of the main visual right now when you drive by. We use there's hundreds of products for slope stabilization on the market, but we need a very special one that will hold the slope, hold any shear stress from the water, but also has large enough gaps that flowering species can come through. Many of them are designed just to allow sort of turf crafts to go through. The groups don't really, all they want to make sure is the soil's not moving, right? They're not thinking about anything other than that. And we need, these, if you think of a cone flower, right? It's got these big basal leaves. So the gaps need to be big enough so that it can come through, unfurl, and grow. So these are made of 100% biodegradable material. They won't last that long. Really, the vegetation is what's going to be holding the slope. And for the most part, you shouldn't see it after we really get boogieing on growth.
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. And I just to add a little bit to that, this is a material that we spec very regularly as natural areas folks. So it made a lot of sense for us to use this. There are tacks. We're tacking this in. And yeah, as mentioned, there's plenty of room for the plants that we seeded in to bust right through it. It doesn't, it will hold long enough for the plants to take root. And take root is meant truly. A lot of these plants that we're using have double, triple, even 5 times as much underground biomass as they do above ground biomass. In fact, one of my favorite sweatshirts for my old company, AES, shows, here's the soil layer, and there's all these cool little plants here, and then the whole bottom of it is the average, what the roots look like deep beneath them. So the real soil stabilization here is the plants themselves once they get growing. And I love this material because I'm a research herpetologist. I've done work with snakes for many, many years now. I love them. And one of the things that drives me insane is a lot of the non-natural materials that are used to stabilize soil. You mean well, but putting these down, but snakes get caught in them and die, and this material is pliable enough that should a snake get in there, it can get its way out with ease. And as mentioned, it's a natural material, so it biodegrades and actually just contributes to the soil chemistry over the long run. So pretty cool. Safety is key, and gravity is really what we're working with here. So now you can see, it's kind of neat to see Rebecca's plan for the plan view, looking down and then seeing the footprint with these the jute fiber, the matting. So it's installed. It's been a successful project, I would say. And now is the hardest thing for all humans, patience. And so, your average warm season grass meadow doesn't reach its peak until 4th, 5th year. We do, as Rebecca mentioned, and Larry Weaner and Associates, we can go to the next slide while I'm talking about this, has great experience with understanding those phases, using native plants that'll boost out early, give that aesthetic value, but also be the nursery for those slower growing plants to make their way into the landscape. So what are we doing this for, right? Obviously, there's all these aesthetic reasons. We want to increase botanical diversity. We're all plant nerds at heart. And then also we want to support wildlife, and that's why is this wildlife biologist talking about a contracting component, right? And this is why really excited that most of the work that we do at our company, we study the landscape, then we design it, then we install, then we study it again, and what we learn provides adaptive management, so we can ensure success not only for that project, but be that much better armed when we engage the next project. And our company's been doing that for over 30 years. So we were thrilled when Nancy enthusiastically agreed that we could implement some ecological monitoring, some pre-construction goals. So next slide. We identified 2 primary taxa to study in order to really understand if the plants, if all of this is worth it. Sure, it might look beautiful, but are we actually providing value for wildlife? Is that something that we can say with confidence and provide meaningful data and get people really excited about what's being done? So those 2 groups we decided are one group of insects, the Hymenoptera family, which are bees, ants, and wasps. There are 6 groups within the insect. Within the insect group, there's 6 families, or 6 orders actually. This one has this is a great metric for understanding plant diversity on the site, looking at, because bees and wasps not only are great nectaring, they don't just nectar, they pollinate, right? They're well known as pollinators. But then also the world of wasps gets really funky and cool with kleptoparasites and galls and all kinds of other cool things. So the presence of wasp diversity within the landscape can tell us a lot about what's going on. And then birds, near and dear to my heart, amazing group that's are phenomenal indicators of ecosystem condition. I could be dropped anywhere on the planet and I could close my eyes and listen. And as long as I know the bird, let's start with just North America. Drop me off anywhere in North America and blindfolded, and I listen to the birds, I could probably tell you about the landscape I'm in just by virtue of the sound of the songs. And it really is that reliable. So they're very specific with their nesting criteria and their diets, especially during the breeding season, what food they're bringing to their young. And often they're bringing insects to feed their young. If I had the time, I'd put a poll out and ask you what the largest herbivore, what animal consumes the most plant material on the planet. But without putting it out and everyone unmuting, I'll just do the spoiler. It's caterpillars, it's insects. Insects are the largest herbivores on the planet, larval Lepidoptera. And they're just full of protein and fat. They're phenomenal food sources for all these amazing birds that we like to hear sing and see calling. And this right here is actually a female orchard oriole that I observed singing in this photograph, which is kind of cool. For all you bird nerds out there, some of you may know that some female birds do sing. It's very underdocumented, but this is a female orchard oriole. The orchid is a species that we did not detect breeding on site, but we think very well could after our restoration. So it's something to keep an eye out for. Next slide, please.
Maybe because there are a lot of photos here, a lot of words. I'm not sure.
Oh, it's moving slow.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, while that's perhaps taking a minute to move along.
Your next slide, Mike, is about the pre-construction results.
Right. Yeah. So on the next slide, it's talking about either the insects or the birds. So for the birds, we identified 6 locations. These are fixed points where we stand. It's for a set amount of time, and we're documenting birds by sight and by sound and by behavior down to species. And so we're able to, okay, well, let's switch to the critters. So, or the insects rather. Here I am setting up some bee bowl traps. We did 2 methods. We did a sweep method where we just walk through with a net in the target areas. And then we also set these bee bowls out. They sit for 24 hours. We come collect the data. We worked with a good friend of mine who's a prominent research entomologist, Dr. Dan Duran, to identify all of our catch. And as you can see, we identified 12 species, 4 bees, 6 wasps, 2 ant species. The abundance varies. Some of those, it's only 1 individual. Some are much more common within that. And you can see we found kleptoparasites, nectaring species, pollinators. For the most part, we found generalists, and this is what we would expect to see. The bycatch included flower flies. So, within the Diptera group, hoverflies, they often look like they're mimicking bees, beautiful little guys. Various beetles and Lepidoptera. We chose just Hymenoptera, and we were only 1 time of year. So we're gonna have to replicate this same time of year post-construction to really be apples to apples. And this is a photo of a cuckoo wasp, which is a kleptoparasite, really beautiful, one of the less common species that we found on site. So it's neat to see the resilience of nature, even within this highly simplified landscape. Things want to be there. It is what it is. It's baseline data. We strongly suspect that we're going to find a greater diversity when we come back post-construction and implement these methodologies, same time of year, same methods, et cetera. So birds, we set up 6 points. We identified 45 species. Of those, we observed evidence of 18 of those species breeding within the project area. They're mostly generalist passerine, like mourning doves, northern mockingbird, American crow, but some prettier species too. They're below there in the sumac. I'm sure they're very grateful that we appreciate and have retained the sumac as gray catbirds. It's a neotropical migrant, beautiful bird. They do mimic as well. They mimic every song just once, so it really sounds like a mess when they sing. Brown thrashers mimic twice, and northern mockingbirds mimic 3 or more. So that's one of our mimidae, the mimicking bird species. Beautiful critter by his own right, but pretty hardy, pretty common species whose global population is considered to be stable. And then above that is a photo of a Baltimore oriole. This guy set up territory. He's probably been here before. You can see he's in a beautiful, one of the more mature oaks. The woodland setting within a cemetery is actually really good for this species. They build their nests, and they're like silk-like socks that hang, and they want to be in a big mature tree over an open space. There's a lot of big mature trees over open space in a cemetery. So one thing of note is this is late May. This guy is as pretty as he's going to get for the breeding season. So he's singing his song, he's maintaining his territory. His breast has a burst of orange, but otherwise is very yellow. That's an indicator of diet. Reds, yellows, and oranges are indicators of dietary fitness within birds. We strongly suspect if this guy sticks around long enough, if he lives long enough and he breeds here for the next few years, that our increase in food diversity on the site will increase the quality of his habitat, and we could see this guy out here with a much more orange chest. Next slide. And I guess I'll pass it back to you, Rebecca, to talk about next steps.
Yeah, so again, if you drive by, you'll see a beautiful meadow sign and a lot of jute. But really, what's happening now is Mike's team and my team, as well as folks at the cemetery, are gonna make sure that this project, is developing as we expect, and where it's not, we're gonna manage in an adaptive way. We've seen a lot in doing meadows for over 30 years, but things are different. And in truth, with climate change, but things are really different. We're seeing flashier storms, longer droughts. And so the idea is that we'll have all these eyes on the site. As things evolve, some things will be able to sort of favor the great things that are happening and make changes so that if we do get some weed incursion, we do get some erosion, we'll be able to adapt to it really quickly. We've also, so as I showed before, we designed sort of 3 acres, sort of from that edge on Hunting Park Avenue, right where it turns back onto Kelly Drive on the south side, and then sort of moving towards East Falls. We're right now working on what we're calling sort of phase 2, which is that blue line shown in that lower drawing. And that actually sort of, that what I was talking about, that we wanted to work in these sort of multiple 1 acre parcels, and we would have to wait until we finish one and sort of get it established. Because of the way that the cemetery's address works, we can actually work on this section phase 2 sort of simultaneously. So the hope is that we get that through permitting sooner rather than later and get started on that. There's some real similarities between the other areas, and the seed mixes will be quite similar, but it has its own challenges as well. There's a really beautiful existing wall, and how it sort of interacts with the property line and where the dell is going to be another interesting challenge. And so, yeah, we're going to keep hopefully moving forward with installation and really sort of making sure that this thing evolves as we hope to. It is very, very different than a typical landscape. You plant a garden and you take a step back, and maybe the plants are a little smaller, than you would hope, or there's some gaps that'll fill in quickly. The seeded meadow, you walk away, and at this point, you see burlap essentially. So, really sort of waiting and seeing and helping it get to that, year 3, year 4, where it's really positioned to be this self-sustaining landscape. It will always need maintenance. We'll always need a careful eye, but it's good. Those first few years are where you're doing the building blocks, the stepping stones to get to that. And then, like Mike said, they've worked out that they're going to do additional surveys, and we're really going to be able to see, if and when this thing becomes much more valuable to the species and the groups that Mike was talking about. So it's definitely a place, walking, driving, visiting the cemetery to keep an eye on. We're really excited to see how it evolves, and we'll just keep on trucking. We're excited. So I think that's all.
Yeah. I will just end by saying, I hope everybody can understand why now we have a dream team working for us. Rebecca and Mike and their respective companies have just been incredible. We've been learning a lot, and we're anxious for the spring to see what pops up. This addition going south, phase 2, we're fortunately able to do because we didn't spend all the money in the grant, but eventually we're going to run out and not have enough to do the entire hillside, which is the goal. So we're going to continue to seek funding and eventually do the entire Kelly Drive hillside to the extent that we can, and really make this landscape a better one for all species. And with that, I think that is my last our last slide, and I'll turn it back to the hosts